The factory whistle screamed before dawn, long and metallic, cutting through the Ohio winter like a blade. It echoed off brick walls blackened by coal smoke and frost, rolling over rows of clapboard houses where lights flickered on one by one. Inside the Republic steelworks, men pulled on gloves, stiff with yesterday's sweat, stamped their boots against the cold, and took their places along the line. Frank Delaney stood among them, 27 years old, shoulders already heavy with a war he hadn't yet seen. He slid his lunch pail under the bench and watched a slab of glowing steel crawl forward like a living thing. The heat kissed his face. Sparks snapped and flew. Somewhere far away, across an ocean he'd never crossed, men were dying. Here, in Ohio, they were building the tools that decided who would die tomorrow. Frank had wanted to enlist the morning after Pearl Harbor. He still remembered the radio crackling in his parents' kitchen, his mother's hand flying to her mouth, his father going very still. But Frank's name had been stamped with a different kind of order. Essential war industry, deferred, needed here. "You'll fight your war right where you stand," his father had said, trying to make it sound like an honor. Frank wasn't sure it felt like one. On the other side of the Atlantic, the war roared in earnest. In North Africa, American boys tasted combat for the first time, their confidence stripped away by German guns and desert sun. In the Pacific, Marines bled onto coral beaches with names most Americans couldn't pronounce. And in Europe, a continent groaned under iron boots. Adolf Hitler believed time was on his side. From Berlin, he looked west and saw softness, democracies tangled in debate, factories slowed by labor disputes, a nation of shopkeepers and movie stars unwilling to sacrifice comfort. He saw America as a loud engine that would never fully start. He underestimated the quiet violence of assembly lines, the relentless arithmetic of production schedules, the fury of a country that learned how to turn grief into output. In England, Captain James "Red" Harrigan learned what that fury looked like when it arrived in crates. He stood on the tarmac at RAF Molesworth, hands shoved into his jacket pockets, watching the ground crew swarm a newly arrived B-17. Fresh aluminum skin gleamed weakly under grey skies. The bomber smelled of oil, paint, and newness. A newborn dropped straight into hell. "They just keep coming," muttered Lieutenant Charlie Weiss beside him, a Brooklyn kid with nervous eyes and a smile that never quite reached them. "Like Detroit's growing wings." Red snorted. "Long as they keep coming faster than the Germans can knock 'em down." Charlie glanced at the sky, where clouds hung low and heavy. "You really believe that?" Red didn't answer right away. He'd been flying missions over occupied Europe for 6 months now. He'd seen flak tear planes apart like paper toys. He'd watched friends vanish into smoke with no parachutes following. Belief was a luxury that came and went. "I believe," he finally said, "that somebody back home is working double shifts so we get another chance. That somebody might have been Frank Delaney." By spring of 1943, Frank's factory ran day and night. Women replaced men at the presses, hair wrapped in scarves, hands steady and fierce. The radio played swing music between news bulletins, voices cheerful and grim in equal measure. Casualty numbers rose, production quotas rose faster. Frank read the headlines on his lunch break, grease-stained fingers smudging ink. U-boats sunk off East Coast, bombing raids over Germany. Each word felt like a tug on a rope tying him to men he'd never meet. Then came the letter. It arrived on a Tuesday, thin and official. His mother stood at the table while he opened it, her eyes fixed on the envelope like it might explode. Frank read it once, then again, heart hammering. His deferment was ending. The army needed him now. Training blurred into mud and shouting and exhaustion. Georgia pine forests replaced Ohio smokestacks. Frank learned the weight of an M1 rifle, the rhythm of marching, the strange comfort of a bunk full of snoring strangers who slowly became brothers. He learned how to dig a foxhole fast and deep, how to keep moving when his lungs burned, how to swallow fear and keep his hands steady. Private Delaney shipped out in early 1944, one of thousands crossing the Atlantic in crowded transports. The ocean rolled endlessly beneath them, grey and cold, the horizon empty and ominous. At night, Frank lay in his bunk, listening to the thrum of engines, and wondered if any piece of steel he'd shaped with his own hands was flying somewhere above him now. Somewhere in France, Sergeant Bill Kowalski waited. Bill had landed with the first waves in North Africa and chased the war across deserts and mountains. He'd seen what German armor could do when it moved unopposed, how quickly confidence turned to panic when bullets came from places you couldn't see. Now, he studied the English countryside from behind a hedgerow during training exercises, chewing on an unlit cigarette. "They say we'll have everything we need this time," said Corporal Eddie Ramirez, crouched beside him. "Tanks, planes, trucks, more than the Krauts can handle." Bill spat into the dirt. "They always say that." "But it's different now," Eddie insisted. "My cousin works at a plant in California, says they're cranking out planes like sausages." Bill looked out over the fields, imagining beaches bristling with guns, the sea red and churning. He thought about how many things had to go right for a single man to make it ashore alive. "Let's hope your cousin's right." In Germany, factories burned under Allied bombs, yet Hitler demanded more tanks, more planes, more miracles. He railed against shortages, blamed saboteurs, refused to accept that the enemy's strength wasn't just on the battlefield, but humming steadily behind it, out of reach. The Allies prepared to test that strength in blood. On the eve of the invasion, Frank sat on his pack aboard a landing craft, seasick and silent. Rain slicked the deck, engines rumbled, men checked and rechecked their gear, hands trembling despite themselves. A voice shouted over the noise, "5 minutes!" Frank closed his eyes and thought of the factory whistle, the heat on his face, the steady march of steel. He wondered if any of that mattered once the ramp dropped. As dawn crept over the channel, the first shells screamed overhead. The war was about to collect its debt, and no one yet knew how high the cost would be. The ramp slammed down, and the world exploded. Frank Delaney didn't remember standing up. One moment, he was crouched, fingers locked around his rifle. The next, he was running through surf that yanked at his legs like hands trying to pull him under. Bullets hissed across the water. Men fell forward, backward, sideways, their bodies jerking as if the beach itself rejected them. "Move! Move!" someone screamed. The sand was already dark with blood. German machine guns hammered from the bluffs. The sound flat and merciless, like a giant tearing cloth. Frank threw himself behind a steel hedgehog, heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of his chest. He gasped for air, lungs burning, and tried not to look at the man beside him who wasn't moving. Sergeant Bill Kowalski crawled up behind him, face smeared with sand and sweat. "You Delaney!" he shouted. Frank nodded, unable to speak. "Congratulations," Bill said grimly. "You made it." They pushed forward yard by yard, bodies pressed low, explosions tossing sand into the air like dirty snow. Frank's world narrowed to commands, noise, and the simple act of staying alive. When they finally reached the base of the bluff hours later, his hands were shaking so badly he could barely reload. By nightfall, the beach belonged to them, but at a cost no training film had prepared him for. Across the channel, Captain Red Harrigan watched the coast of France slide beneath his bomber formation. The sky was alive with aircraft, a mechanical swarm stretching to the horizon. Below them, smoke rose in thick columns from the shore. "Hell of a show," Charlie Weiss said over the intercom, trying to sound impressed. Red tightened his grip on the yoke. "Yeah. Let's just make sure it's worth it." Flak burst ahead, black flowers blooming violently in the air. The bomber shuddered as fragments rattled against the fuselage. Red kept them steady, eyes locked forward. Somewhere below, men like Frank were clawing inland, praying the planes overhead could keep the German guns down. They dropped their bombs and banked hard, engines straining. On the way back, Red glanced at the empty spaces in the formation where planes should have been. He didn't ask who they'd lost. He already knew. In Normandy, the hedgerows became the next enemy. They were thick, ancient walls of earth and roots, taller than a man, and riddled with hidden firing positions. Every field was a trap. Every advance cost blood. Frank learned how to listen for the faint click of a rifle bolt, how to freeze when birds suddenly went quiet. One afternoon, as rain pattered softly on leaves overhead, Eddie Ramirez was hit. He'd been joking about California sunshine moments before. Now, he lay on his back, eyes wide, breath bubbling red. Frank knelt beside him, hands slick, pressing down uselessly. "Medic!" he screamed. Eddie grabbed his sleeve weakly. Hey, Delaney," he whispered. "You ever been to L.A.?" Frank swallowed hard. "No." "You should go," Eddie said, trying to smile. "It's real nice." Then his hand went slack. Frank stayed there too long, staring at Eddie's face, until Bill hauled him up by the collar. "Later," Bill said quietly. "You grieve later." That night, Frank couldn't sleep. He stared up at the hedgerow canopy and thought about Ohio, about the factory, about steel that didn't bleed when it was cut. Back home, the factory whistle blew longer than ever. Frank's mother folded his last letter carefully and tucked it into her apron before heading to her shift. The plant had added another line, another building. Tanks rolled out like iron beasts, fresh paint gleaming. Posters on the wall showed smiling soldiers and bold letters. More is not enough. She worked until her hands ached, because stopping felt like betrayal. In Germany, shortages tightened like a noose. Fuel ran thin. Replacement parts didn't arrive. Bombers came day and night, their numbers growing, their accuracy improving. German pilots scrambled fewer planes each week. Hitler demanded loyalty and sacrifice, but the arithmetic of war no longer favored him. Still, the fighting on the ground was brutal. In July, Frank's unit pushed toward a small town whose name he couldn't pronounce. The Germans fought hard, desperate, cornered. Mortars fell without warning. A shell landed near the road, throwing Frank backward. His ears rang. Dirt filled his mouth. When he could hear again, he heard screaming. Bill lay a few yards away, leg mangled, blood soaking into the dirt. Frank crawled to him, hands shaking. "Hang on, Sarge," he said, voice cracking. "Hang on!" Bill looked at him, pain etched deep. "You keep moving," he said. "That's an order." A medic arrived, dragging Bill away. Frank watched them disappear around a bend, not knowing if he'd ever see the sergeant again. He kept moving. By August, the breakout came. Tanks surged forward with new confidence, engines roaring. The Allies flooded through gaps the Germans could no longer seal. Roads clogged with wrecked enemy vehicles. Prisoners marched past, hollow-eyed. Frank rode on the back of a tank once, fingers gripping hot metal, feeling the strange surge of hope that came with momentum. Maybe, just maybe, they could win this thing. Over Germany, Red Harrigan flew deeper and deeper, targets stretching beyond the Ruhr. Each mission was longer, more dangerous, but the formations were thicker, the escorts stronger. P-51s danced around them like guardian angels. Charlie leaned over during one long flight. "You hear? The Krauts are running out of gas?" Red nodded. "Yeah. Turns out factories matter." They laughed, short and tense, knowing laughter didn't make them invincible. On the ground in France, Frank stood in a liberated village watching civilians emerge cautiously from cellars. An old woman pressed his hands and wept. A child stared at him like he was something out of a storybook. Frank felt older than his years, worn thin by weeks of fighting. He thought of Eddie, of Bill, somewhere behind the lines, of steel turned into tanks and planes and shells. The war wasn't over, not even close. But for the first time since the ramp had dropped, Frank felt the faint, dangerous pull of belief that all of it, the factories and the blood and the fire, might be bending the war toward an end the Germans could no longer avoid. Then the orders came. They were pushing east, into Germany itself. Frank tightened his helmet strap and checked his rifle. Whatever waited ahead would be worse. It always was. And there would be no turning back. Germany in winter was a different kind of hell. The forests were black and skeletal, branches clawing at low clouds. Snow muffled footsteps and swallowed blood without comment. Frank Delaney's breath came out in white bursts as he trudged along a frozen road, rifle heavy, fingers numb, despite wool gloves. The war felt older here, meaner. Every village was shattered stone and burned timber. Every mile closer to the heart of the Reich carried a weight no map could show. They called it the Bulge, before anyone understood what it meant. The Germans hit just before dawn, artillery ripping through the quiet like a scream. Frank woke to the ground, jumping beneath him, to men shouting and scrambling as shells tore trees apart. Splinters whined through the air like angry insects. "Contact! All sides!" someone yelled. The forest erupted. Machine gun fire stitched the snow. Mortars thumped, closer now. Frank dove behind a fallen log, heart pounding, ears ringing. Shadows moved between the trees. German infantry, grey coats blending into the gloom, moving fast and desperate. They weren't retreating anymore. Sergeant Kowalski wasn't there. Frank felt his absence like a missing limb. Command fell to a young lieutenant, whose voice shook as he tried to shout orders over the noise. "Hold the line!" the lieutenant cried. "Hold the—" A blast cut him off mid-sentence. Frank fired until his rifle clicked empty, hands working on instinct. He reloaded, fired again. Men around him screamed, cursed, prayed. The cold seeped into his bones, but sweat soaked his back. For hours, or minutes, he couldn't tell, they clung to that patch of forest, trading ground for blood. German tanks growled somewhere beyond the trees, their engines a low, terrifying thunder. "We're surrounded," a voice said near Frank. "Jesus, we're surrounded." Frank pressed his face into the snow, smelling cordite and pine sap, and thought of the factory floor again, of lines that never stopped moving, of machines that didn't get tired. He wondered if they were still moving now. In the sky, far above the clouds, Captain Red Harrigan fought a different battle. The weather grounded them for days, thick clouds shielding German movements. When the skies finally broke, Red's bomber group was airborne before dawn, engines straining in the bitter cold. Their target was a rail yard, feeding the German advance, steel arteries pumping life into a last gamble. "Feels like the whole damn war's riding on this one," Charlie Weiss said, his voice tight. Red nodded. He'd been flying long enough to feel when something mattered more than usual. The airspace ahead crackled with flak as they approached, bursts thick and vicious. "Steady," Red said. "Steady." The bomber lurched as a near miss rocked them. Warning lights blinked. The engineer shouted something Red barely heard. He kept them on course, jaw clenched, eyes fixed on the bomb site. Below, trains waited. Fuel, ammunition, hope. "Bombs away!" The plane jumped as its load fell free. Red banked hard, engines screaming protest. A flak burst caught them on the tail, metal tearing loose with a shriek. The bomber shuddered, wounded but alive. Charlie laughed shakily. "That'll slow 'em down." Red didn't answer. He was counting the planes again, marking absences in the formation like fresh graves. On the ground, Frank's unit was running out of ammunition. Snow fell heavier now, soft and indifferent. German voices echoed through the trees, closer than before. Frank checked his last clips, fingers stiff. "We ain't gonna make it," someone whispered. Frank didn't know what to say. He thought of Eddie Ramirez and Los Angeles sunshine. He thought of his mother at the factory, hands raw, back bent, believing this all meant something. Then, faint at first, came a sound that didn't belong to the forest. Engines. They grew louder, unmistakable. The deep, powerful roar of American armor. Tanks burst through the trees like metal gods, guns blazing. Infantry followed, shouting, firing, surging forward with a fury that turned the tide in minutes. The Germans fell back, some surrendering, others vanishing into the woods. Frank sank to his knees, laughing and crying at once, rifle slipping from his hands. Relief crashed over him so hard he felt dizzy. Later, as medics moved among the wounded, Frank learned why the tanks had arrived when they did. Fuel shortages had stalled German armor. Bombed rail lines had delayed reinforcements. The offensive had outrun its supplies. Industry, silent, relentless, had reached into the forest and tipped the scales. Weeks later, Frank crossed the Rhine. The river was wide and grey, choked with debris. Engineers worked under fire, throwing bridges across while artillery thundered overhead. Frank helped carry wounded men to the far bank, boots slipping on wet planks. On the eastern side, Germany unfolded in ruins, cities reduced to skeletons. Civilians stared with hollow eyes, their faces etched with exhaustion and fear. The war here felt like a dying animal, still dangerous, still capable of lashing out, but fading. In April, they reached a camp. Frank smelled it before he saw it. Death and rot hung heavy in the air. The gates stood open, twisted. Inside, figures moved slowly, impossibly thin, eyes too large for their faces. Frank's rifle slipped from his hands. A man in striped rags reached out and touched his sleeve, whispering something Frank couldn't understand. Gratitude, maybe, or disbelief. Frank felt something inside him crack open, raw and aching. All the factories, all the bombs, all the killing. It led here. To proof of what happened when hate was given time and tools. He turned away, vomiting into the dirt, sobs tearing out of him. Later that day, word spread through the unit like a shockwave. Hitler was dead. Some men cheered. Others sat in silence, staring at nothing. Frank felt neither joy nor relief, just a deep, bone-tired emptiness. The war had taken too much to end cleanly. In the sky, Red Harrigan flew his last mission days later. The targets were scattered now, the resistance weak. When they landed, Charlie slapped him on the shoulder. "Guess that's it, Skipper." Red climbed down from the cockpit, legs shaking. He looked at the rows of planes, at the ground crews already prepping for tomorrow, habits slow to die. "Yeah," he said softly, "guess it is." For Frank, the fighting stopped suddenly, like a door slammed shut. One day there was shooting. The next, there was silence so loud it hurt. He sat on a crate outside a ruined town, helmet in his hands, and wondered how a man went back to being normal after everything he'd seen. The war was over, but the weight of it would never leave. The silence after the war felt unnatural, like the world was holding its breath. Frank Delaney noticed it first in the mornings. No artillery, no engines grinding to life before dawn. Just birdsong drifting over shattered rooftops and the distant murmur of men who no longer had to whisper. He woke one morning outside a German town whose name he still couldn't pronounce and realized his hands weren't shaking anymore. That scared him more than the gunfire ever had. They waited for weeks. Paperwork, orders, rumors. Soldiers drifted through the ruins like ghosts, unsure what to do with themselves now that killing was no longer required. Some drank. Some wrote letters they'd never send. Some stared at the horizon as if expecting the war to sneak back in when they weren't looking. Frank volunteered for guard duty at a displaced persons camp. It felt like penance, or maybe obligation. He watched survivors relearn the simple acts of living, standing in line, laughing quietly, arguing over food. A woman taught her child to write his name in the dirt with a stick. An old man sang in a voice worn thin but stubbornly alive. One afternoon, a man approached Frank hesitantly. He was older than Frank, but moved like someone much older still. "You American?" the man asked in careful English. Frank nodded. The man searched his face, then reached into his coat and pulled out a bent, grimy piece of metal. He placed it in Frank's palm. It was a fragment of a bomb casing, edges twisted and sharp. "From factory," the man said. "Your country?" Frank swallowed. He didn't know what to say. The man closed Frank's fingers around the metal. "It saved us," he said simply. That night, Frank lay awake staring at the stars, thinking about steel, how it could be shaped into cages or keys depending on who held the hammer. In England, Captain Red Harrigan packed his flight jacket into a duffel bag that smelled of oil and sweat and old fear. The airfield felt smaller now, quieter. Many of the men he'd flown with were gone, their names etched onto boards no one wanted to look at for too long. Charlie Weiss stood beside him, hands in his pockets. "You heading back to Brooklyn?" Red asked. Charlie nodded. "Yeah, my ma's gonna cry like I rose from the dead." Red smiled faintly. "You earned it." They shook hands, awkward and sincere. No speeches, no promises to stay in touch. War made bonds that didn't need maintenance. As Red boarded the transport home, he looked out the window at the rows of aircraft left behind. Thousands of planes, built faster than any enemy had thought possible. He wondered if the men who'd once scoffed at American industry would ever understand what had really beaten them. Back in Ohio, the factory whistle blew for the last time. Frank's mother stood among a crowd of workers as the line slowed, then stopped. Machines powered down one by one, the sudden quiet ringing in their ears. Some cheered, some cried, some simply stood there, unsure how to step out of a world that had demanded everything from them. She walked home that evening in the soft light of early summer, hands aching, heart pounding with hope and fear. When she reached the house, there was a man sitting on the front steps. For a moment, she didn't recognize him. He stood as she approached, taller than she remembered, thinner, eyes older. He held his cap in both hands. "Hi, Ma," Frank said. She crossed the distance without a word and wrapped her arms around him, pressing her face into his shoulder, as if to prove he was real. Frank breathed in the familiar smell of home and felt something inside him finally loosen. The months that followed were strange and uneven. Parades and speeches clashed with nightmares and sudden silences. Frank found work again at the steel plant, the machines familiar but different now. Every clang echoed with memory. One day, he caught himself watching a fresh sheet of steel roll forward, perfect and unblemished. He reached out and touched it, palm flat, feeling the cold strength beneath his skin. He understood then. The war hadn't been won by one moment, one battle, or one man. It had been won by millions of hands, on rifles, on stretchers, on factory floors, by people who believed that doing their part, day after day, could outweigh any dictator's ambition. Hitler had wagered that America would tire, that its factories would falter, that distance would dilute resolve. He'd been wrong, catastrophically wrong, because steel remembered the hands that shaped it. Years later, Frank stood at a small memorial outside the factory. Names were carved into stone, men who'd never come home. He traced Eddie Ramirez's name with a fingertip, then Bill Kowalski's. Bill had survived, barely, living out his days with a limp and a grin that never quite hid the pain. Frank took a step back and looked at the building behind him. The smokestacks were quieter now, the lines shorter, but the foundation remained. A young boy stood nearby, staring up at the names. Frank recognized the look, the mixture of curiosity and awe. "Did you know them?" the boy asked. Frank nodded. "Yeah, I did." "Were they heroes?" Frank thought of fear and mud and steel, of factories and forests and skies full of fire. "They were," he said. "And so were a lot of people you'll never see on that wall." The boy considered this, then nodded solemnly. Frank turned away, the late afternoon sun warm on his back. The war was over, but its story lived on, not just in books or films, but in every bridge, every plane, every quiet act of rebuilding that followed. History would argue over strategies and speeches, over generals and battles. But Frank knew the truth. The war had been decided long before the last shot was fired, on factory floors, in foundries, in the relentless belief that unity and work could outproduce hate. And that belief had carried them through fire and home again.